The gunshot echoed across the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, Wyoming, making Nora Rivers flinch as she stood at her bedroom window, watching another drunken confrontation outside her father's saloon. It was 1876, and at 20 years old, she'd seen enough violence to last several lifetimes, yet her father seemed determined to add more to her tally. The sound of breaking glass downstairs told her that tonight would be no different from any other. Her father would drink, gamble, and eventually pass out, leaving her to clean up the mess come morning. Nora tucked a strand of her auburn hair behind her ear and turned away from the window. The small bedroom above the saloon had been her prison for as long as she could remember. Her mother had died when she was just 8, leaving her at the mercy of a man whose love for whiskey far outweighed any paternal affection. She glanced at the small leather-bound journal on her bedside table, the only thing she had left of her mother besides fading memories. She picked up the journal and thumbed through the pages filled with her mother's elegant script, stories of a life before Redemption Creek, of dreams that had withered and died in this harsh frontier. Nora had her own dreams of escaping, of finding somewhere she could breathe freely without the stench of liquor and desperation filling her lungs. The sound of heavy footsteps on the stairs made her snap the journal shut and tuck it beneath her pillow. Her father, George Rivers, burst through the door without knocking, his face flushed with alcohol and excitement. "Pack your things, girl," he slurred, swaying slightly. "Got something big planned for tomorrow." Nora crossed her arms. "What are you talking about, father?" "Found a solution to our problems," he said with a grin that made her stomach twist. "The debts, the mortgage, everything." "What solution?" she asked, though a terrible suspicion was already forming. "You'll see tomorrow." He turned to leave, then stopped. "Wear your best dress. The blue one your mama had made for you. Want you lookin' presentable." After he left, Nora sat on her bed, dread settling over her like a heavy blanket. Her father's gambling debts had been mounting for months, and the bank was threatening to foreclose on the saloon. She knew him well enough to know that whatever solution he'd found would benefit no one but himself. Morning came too quickly. Nora had barely slept, her mind racing with possibilities, each worse than the last. She put on the blue dress as instructed, the fabric now a little worn but still the finest thing she owned. She pinned her hair up the way her mother had taught her, trying to ignore the trembling in her fingers. When she came downstairs, the saloon was already bustling despite the early hour. Her father stood at the bar, cleaner and more presentable than she'd seen him in months. The sight only increased her anxiety. "There she is," George announced loudly as she descended the stairs. Several men turned to look at her, their gazes making her skin crawl. "Ain't she a sight?" "Father," Nora said quietly, approaching him. "What's happening?" "Patience, girl," he replied, patting her arm with a heavy hand. "Just wait here and look pretty." Nora stood uncomfortably by the bar as more men filed in, most of them local ranchers and miners she recognized. Some nodded respectfully toward her, while others stared with undisguised interest that made her want to flee upstairs. By noon, the saloon was packed. George called for attention by banging a glass on the bar, silencing the crowd. "Gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying across the room. "As some of you know, I've fallen on hard times lately, banks breathin' down my neck, and I need a considerable sum to keep this fine establishment." He put his arm around Nora's shoulders, holding her firmly when she tried to pull away. "So I'm offerin' something special today. My daughter, Nora. 20 years old, healthy, can cook and clean better than any woman in the territory. She'll make some lucky man a fine wife." Nora felt the blood drain from her face. "Father, no," she whispered. He ignored her, continuing, "Let's start the bidding at $500. A stunned silence fell over the room, broken when a grizzled miner in the back raised his hand. 500, 550, called another. Nora's ears began to ring as the numbers climbed, her father's grip on her shoulder tightening with each bid. She looked desperately around the room, searching for a friendly face, but found only greed and lust staring back at her. 800, shouted a rancher old enough to be her grandfather. 900, countered the town's butcher, a widower with 4 children. George beamed, encouraging the bids. She's worth every penny, gentlemen. Think of the comfort a young wife brings a man. Nora wanted to scream, to run, but she was frozen in place by shock and her father's grip. This couldn't be happening. Not even her father would stoop this low. 1,000, came a deep voice from the doorway. The crowd parted to reveal a tall figure silhouetted against the bright sunlight. As he stepped inside, Nora saw a man she didn't recognize, a stranger in town. He was dressed in typical cowboy attire, but there was nothing typical about his presence. He moved with the fluid grace of a mountain lion, green eyes scanning the room before settling on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. 1,200, her father countered eagerly. 1,500, the stranger replied without hesitation. A murmur ran through the crowd. That was more money than most men in town saw in a year. 1,500 going once, George called out, practically salivating. Going twice, she's not yours to sell. The stranger's voice cut through the saloon like a whip crack. He stepped forward, removing his hat to reveal dark hair that curled slightly at his temples. He couldn't have been more than 26 or 27. "Excuse me," George sputtered. "I said," the stranger repeated, each word deliberate, "she's not yours to sell. No person has the right to sell another." "Now see here," George blustered. "I'm her father, which gives you the responsibility to protect her, not auction her off like cattle." The stranger's voice remained steady, but Nora could see the anger in the tightness of his jaw. "I'll pay your $1,500, but not to buy her. To free her from this," he gestured around the room, "disgrace." Nora found her voice at last. "I don't need to be bought or freed by anyone. I'm not property." The stranger turned to her, a hint of admiration flickering in his eyes. "No, madam, you're certainly not. My apologies if I implied otherwise." "Now, wait just a minute," George protested, his face reddening. "We had a deal, we had nothing," the stranger interrupted. "But I'm still willing to pay, not for your daughter, but to settle whatever debts are forcing you to this desperate act." He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch that clinked heavily as he set it on the bar. $1,500. Take it and end this circus." George's eyes darted greedily to the pouch. "Who exactly are you, mister?" "Name's Vaughn Garrison, just passing through." Nora studied him more carefully. His clothes were well worn but of good quality. A gun belt hung at his hip, the weapon clearly well used but meticulously maintained. He carried himself with the confidence of a man who had seen trouble but wasn't looking for more. "Well, Mr. Garrison," George said, reaching for the money, "you've got yourself a—" "No." Nora stepped back, shaking her head. "I'm not going with anyone." "Not with you, Mr. Garrison, and I'm certainly not staying here." She glared at her father. "How dare you? How dare you try to sell your own daughter?" The men in the saloon shifted uncomfortably, many looking ashamed at their participation. Vaughn Garrison kept his eyes on her, respect evident in his gaze. "Miss Rivers," he said softly, "I have no intention of claiming you or forcing you to do anything. My only aim was to stop this transaction." He picked up the pouch again. "This money is yours if you want it. You can use it to leave, start somewhere new." Before Nora could respond, George lunged for the pouch. "That money's mine. We had a deal." Vaughn easily sidestepped him, sending George stumbling into the bar. "The deal was off the moment you tried to sell your daughter. You can't just ride into my town and tell me what I can do with my own family," George shouted, reaching for the gun tucked in his waistband. Several patrons scattered, diving for cover. Nora watched in horror as her father drew his weapon, but before he could aim, Vaughn had his own gun out, the barrel pointed steadily at George's chest. "I wouldn't," Vaughn said calmly. George froze, his bloodshot eyes darting between Vaughn's face and the gun. After a tense moment, he lowered his weapon. "This ain't over," he growled. "It is for today," Vaughn replied, holstering his gun with practiced ease. He turned to Nora. "Miss Rivers, may I suggest we continue this conversation elsewhere?" Nora hesitated only briefly before nodding. The saloon no longer felt like home, not that it ever truly had. "Let me get my things." She hurried upstairs, ignoring her father's protests. In her room, she quickly gathered what little she possessed: a few dresses, her mother's journal, a locket with a faded photograph inside. She paused at her window, looking out at the town that had been her prison for so long. Whatever happened next, she wouldn't be returning here. Downstairs, she found Vaughn waiting by the door. keeping a wary eye on her father who had retreated to the bar to nurse a drink and his wounded pride. The other men had dispersed, leaving the saloon nearly empty. "Ready?" Vaughn asked. Nora nodded, clutching her small bag of possessions. "Where are we going?" "That's entirely up to you, Miss Rivers. I meant what I said. The money is yours with no strings attached." They stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun. Nora blinked, feeling as though she was seeing Redemption Creek clearly for the first time. The dusty street, the weathered buildings, the distant mountains that had always seemed to mock her with their freedom, it all looked different now that she was actually leaving. Vaughn led her to where a magnificent chestnut stallion was hitched. "This is Phoenix," he said, patting the horse's neck. "We'll need to get you a mount if you're planning to travel." "I don't know how to ride," Nora admitted, embarrassed. Despite living in the West her entire life, she'd rarely been allowed beyond the saloon's walls. "I can teach you," Vaughn offered, then added hastily, "or I can arrange for a stagecoach ticket if you'd prefer." Before she could respond, a commotion behind them made them turn. George had staggered out of the saloon, gun in hand once more. "You ain't taking her nowhere." He shouted, his words slurring together. "That money's mine." "Father, please," Nora began, but George was beyond reasoning. $1,500, he spat. "That's what you owe me, Garrison. That's the price." Vaughn pushed Nora behind him. "There is no price, Rivers. She's a person, not merchandise." "Everything has a price in this world," George snarled, raising his gun. Several townsfolk scattered as they realized what was happening. Nora watched in horror as her father's finger tightened on the trigger. The shot rang out, but it wasn't from George's gun. Sheriff Miller had appeared from the direction of his office, his gun smoking. George crumpled to the ground, clutching his shoulder and howling in pain. "That's enough, Rivers," the sheriff said, approaching cautiously. "Heard about your little auction from half the town. Thought I'd better check in." He nodded to Vaughn. "Don't believe we've met." "Vaughn Garrison," Vaughn said, extending his hand. "Just arrived in town, and already in the middle of our biggest commotion in months," Miller observed, shaking Vaughn's hand. "Doc Peterson." He called to a man who'd emerged from a nearby building. "Got a patient for you." As the doctor approached to tend to George, Sheriff Miller turned to Nora. "You all right, Miss Rivers?" "I will be," she said, watching dispassionately as her father was helped to his feet, still moaning. "I'm leaving Redemption Creek." "Can't say I blame you," Miller replied, his weathered face softening. "Your father's had this coming for a long time. I'll make sure he faces charges for what he tried today." "Thank you, Sheriff," Nora said, then looked at Vaughn. "I think I would like to learn to ride, Mr. Garrison." A hint of a smile touched Vaughn's lips. "Then that's where we'll start." After purchasing supplies and a gentle mare for Nora from the local livery, they rode out of town as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon. Nora sat awkwardly in the saddle at first, gripping the reins too tightly, but Vaughn was a patient teacher. By the time they made camp several miles from Redemption Creek, she had begun to find her rhythm. "You're a natural," Vaughn commented as he built a small fire. "Most beginners aren't so quick to adapt." "I've always been good at adapting," Nora replied, watching the flames begin to lick at the kindling. "It was necessary growing up with my father." Vaughn handed her a tin cup of coffee. "Do you want to talk about it?" Nora considered the question as she sipped the strong, bitter liquid. No one had ever really asked about her life before. "My mother died when I was 8, influenza. After that, my father changed. Started drinking more, gambling. He'd always been stern, but he became cruel." She stared into the fire. "I think he blamed me for her death somehow." "I'm sorry," Vaughn said softly. "No child deserves that burden." "What about you?" Nora asked, curious about this man who had so dramatically altered her life's course. "What brings you to Wyoming?" Vaughn was silent for a moment, poking at the fire with a stick. "I was a Texas Ranger," he finally said. "For 5 years, saw things, did things, some I'm proud of, others I'm not." "Is that why you left?" He nodded. "There was a raid on a homestead. Intelligence said it was being used by a gang we'd been tracking. Turned out to be a family, wrong place, wrong name, by the time we realized our mistake." He trailed off, his jaw tight with remembered pain. "You couldn't stay after that," Nora guessed. "No, been drifting since, taking odd jobs. Trying to do right when I can." He glanced at her. "Like today." Thank you, Nora said quietly. Though I'm not sure what happens next, I've never been on my own before. You have options, Vaughn assured her. We can head to the next major town, Cheyenne maybe. You could find work there or continue on to Denver or even further east. And you, she asked, meeting his gaze across the fire. Where are you headed? I haven't decided yet, he admitted. I was thinking about Montana, heard there's good ranching land available there. Nora nodded, looking up at the vast canopy of stars above them. I've never slept outdoors before, she mused. It's beautiful. It is, Vaughn agreed, though when she glanced over, she found him looking at her rather than the stars. He quickly averted his gaze. We should get some rest. I'll take first watch. Is that necessary? Nora asked, suddenly anxious. Probably not, Vaughn conceded. But it's a habit. Territory can be dangerous, especially for travelers. Nora settled onto her bedroll, pulling a blanket over herself. The ground was hard beneath her, but there was a strange comfort in the openness surrounding them, the soft sounds of the horses nearby and Vaughn's steady presence across the fire. Good night, Mr. Garrison, she murmured, her eyes growing heavy. Good night, Miss Rivers, came his quiet reply. Sleep well. Despite her unfamiliar surroundings, Nora fell into the deepest sleep she had experienced in years, free from the sounds of her father's drunken rages and the oppressive walls of the saloon. She woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. Vaughn was already up, tending to a fresh fire and preparing breakfast. The sky was just beginning to lighten with dawn's approach. Morning, he greeted her. Hope you're hungry. Starving, Nora admitted, sitting up and running her fingers through her tangled hair. She felt oddly comfortable with him despite having met him only the day before. Perhaps it was the fact that he had seen her at what should have been her lowest moment, yet had treated her with nothing but respect. Over breakfast, they discussed the route ahead. Vaughn spread out a worn map, pointing out the trails and towns between their current location and Cheyenne. It'll take about 5 days at an easy pace, he explained. There's a small settlement here where we can resupply, and we should reach the railroad by the 4th day. And then what? Nora asked, tracing the thin line that represented the railroad with her finger. Vaughn looked up at her. That depends on what you want, Miss Rivers. Nora, she corrected him. Please call me Nora. After everything that's happened, formality seems unnecessary. A small smile touched his lips. Nora then, and I'm Vaughn. Well, Vaughn, she said, liking the way his name felt on her tongue, I honestly don't know what I want yet. I've never had the luxury of choosing my own path before. Then we don't need to decide everything today, he assured her, folding up the map. Let's just focus on reaching the next town safely. You can think about your options along the way. They broke camp efficiently, Vaughn teaching Nora how to saddle her mare and secure her belongings. By the time the sun had fully risen, they were already on the trail, heading east through rolling grasslands dotted with sagebrush and occasional stands of pine. Nora's body ached from the previous day's riding, but she found herself enjoying the freedom of the open country. Vaughn rode slightly ahead, occasionally pointing out landmarks or wildlife. He was a man of few words, but when he did speak, his observations were thoughtful and often tinged with a dry humor that made her smile. Have you always been on your own? She asked as they rode side by side along a ridge overlooking a winding creek. Vaughn considered the question. Not always. I grew up on a small ranch in Texas, had parents, a younger sister, good folks. Are they still there? He shook his head. Lost them in '67. Fever swept through the county. I was away, serving with a cavalry unit during the tail end of the war. I'm sorry, Nora said softly, understanding the weight of such loss. It was a long time ago, Vaughn replied, though the shadow that crossed his face suggested the pain remained fresh. What about you? Any other family besides your father? My mother had a sister in St. Louis, but we lost touch after she died. Father didn't approve of her. Nora adjusted her hat to better shield her face from the sun. I used to dream about running away to find her, but I was too afraid. Afraid of what? Of leaving what was familiar, I suppose. Of failing. She gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. Ironic that when I finally did leave, it wasn't even my choice. Sometimes the decisions that shape our lives the most are the ones thrust upon us, Vaughn observed. It's what we do afterward that defines us. They fell into a comfortable silence after that, each lost in their own thoughts as the landscape gradually shifted around them. By late afternoon, dark clouds had begun to gather on the horizon. "Storm's coming," Vaughn noted, scanning the sky with a practiced eye. "We should find shelter before it hits." They quickened their pace, and within an hour, Vaughn spotted an abandoned line shack nestled against a small copse of trees. It was little more than a one-room structure with a sagging roof, but it would provide protection from the impending downpour. They reached the shack just as the first heavy drops began to fall. Vaughn quickly led the horses to a lean-to attached to one side of the building while Nora inspected the interior. It was dusty but intact, with a small fireplace, a rickety table, and what remained of a cot frame. "It's not the Palmer House Hotel, but it'll do," Vaughn said as he entered, carrying their supplies. He set about building a fire while Nora cleared away cobwebs and dust as best she could. The storm broke in earnest, rain lashing against the windows and roof with surprising force. Thunder rumbled, and occasionally, lightning illuminated the small space in brief, brilliant flashes. Despite the ferocity outside, Nora felt secure in the shack, warmed by the fire and Vaughn's steady presence. They shared a simple meal of jerky, hard biscuits, and canned peaches luxuries Vaughn had insisted on purchasing before they left town. As night fell and the storm continued, they sat close to the fire, the small room feeling increasingly intimate. "Tell me about your time as a ranger," Nora said, curiosity overcoming her usual reserve. "If you don't mind talking about it." Vaughn leaned back against the wall, stretching his long legs toward the fire. "Not much to tell that's fit for polite conversation. Texas after the war was a rough place. Outlaws, cattle rustlers, border troubles. But you must have had adventures," Nora pressed. "I've spent my entire life in one small town. Even the difficult parts of your life sound fascinating to me." A hint of a smile crossed his face. "I suppose there were some stories worth telling." He considered for a moment. "There was the time I tracked a horse thief across half of Texas, only to discover he was a 14-year-old boy trying to reach his mother in New Mexico." "What did you do?" "Bought him a ticket on the stage and gave him enough money for food." Some crimes come from desperation, not malice. As the night deepened and the storm gradually subsided, Vaughn shared more stories, some humorous, others tense with danger, but all revealing a man with a strong sense of justice tempered by compassion. Nora found herself drawing closer, not just physically but emotionally, to this complex man who had interrupted her father's auction on principle alone. "Your turn," Vaughn eventually said. "There must be more to Nora Rivers than life above a saloon." Nora hesitated. "I'm afraid my stories aren't very exciting. I read whatever books I could find, taught myself mathematics from my father's ledgers, dreamed of seeing places I'd only read about." "Dreams are powerful things," Vaughn said softly. "What was your favorite dream?" "To have my own home," Nora admitted. "Not grand, just mine, with books and windows that look out on something beautiful, maybe a garden." She smiled self-consciously. "Simple dreams. The best kind," Vaughn replied, his voice warm, "the ones that might actually come true." Their eyes met across the diminishing fire, and something shifted in the air between them. Nora felt her heartbeat quicken as Vaughn's gaze dropped briefly to her lips before he looked away, clearing his throat. "We should get some rest," he said, his voice slightly rougher than before. "I'll take the floor, you can have what's left of the cot." "That doesn't seem fair," Nora protested. "You've hardly slept." "I've slept in worse places," Vaughn assured her with a small smile. "The floor's fine." Reluctantly, Nora settled onto the cot while Vaughn arranged his bedroll near the fire. As the embers dimmed, and the only sounds were the occasional drip of rainwater and the soft breathing of the man a few feet away, Nora stared into the darkness, acutely aware of his presence and the unfamiliar feelings stirring within her. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having washed the world clean. They set out early, both slightly awkward around each other after the intimacy of the previous evening. The trail was muddy but passable, and by midday they had covered a considerable distance. As they rode, Nora found herself studying Vaughn when he wasn't looking the way he sat easily in the saddle. the profile of his face against the blue sky, the strength in his hands as he handled the reins. He was unlike any man she had ever known, and the realization that they would eventually part ways filled her with a surprising sadness. They reached the small settlement Vaughn had mentioned by late afternoon. It wasn't much a general store, a blacksmith, a small church, and a handful of homesteads, but after days on the trail, it seemed almost bustling. "We'll stay here tonight," Vaughn decided, nodding toward a modest building with a sign advertising rooms. "Get a proper meal and rest." The proprietor's wife, Mrs. Holloway, showed them to their rooms separate but adjacent with a knowing look that made Nora blush despite the innocence of their relationship. After washing away the dust of travel, they met in the small dining room downstairs, where Mrs. Holloway served a hearty meal of roast chicken, potatoes, and fresh bread. "This is delicious," Nora sighed, realizing how much she'd missed properly cooked food. "Better than trail rations," Vaughn agreed with a smile. They were halfway through the meal when the door opened, admitting three men whose appearance immediately put Vaughn on alert. They were trail-worn and hard-looking, with the unmistakable bearing of men who lived by violence. They surveyed the room before taking a table in the corner, their eyes lingering on Nora in a way that made her skin crawl. "Don't look at them," Vaughn said quietly. "Finish your meal naturally, then head upstairs." "Who are they?" Nora whispered. "Trouble," Vaughn replied, his hand casually moving closer to his gun. "The one on the left, I recognize him from wanted posters. Part of the Blackwater gang, they've been hitting settlements and stagecoaches across 3 territories." Fear flickered through Nora, but she forced herself to continue eating as if nothing was wrong. She could feel the men watching them, their attention a palpable weight. "The lady looks familiar," one of them said loudly. "Ain't she George Rivers' girl from up Redemption Creek way?" Nora froze, her fork halfway to her mouth. "Mind your business, friend," Vaughn replied without turning, his voice deceptively calm. "Heard there was quite a show there couple days back," the man continued, ignoring the warning. "Old George trying to auction off his daughter." Word travels fast in these parts. The other 2 men snickered, and one made a crude remark that sent heat rushing to Nora's face. Vaughn's jaw tightened, but his expression remained controlled. "Miss Rivers, I believe you were heading upstairs." Nora nodded, understanding his intent. She stood carefully, keeping her eyes down as she moved toward the stairs. "Leaving so soon, pretty lady?" called one of the men. "Night's just getting started." She quickened her pace, heart pounding as she reached the staircase. Behind her, she heard the scrape of chairs as someone stood. "Sit down," came Vaughn's voice, quiet but carrying an unmistakable threat. Nora paused on the stairs, turning to see Vaughn now standing, facing the 3 men. One of them had risen as well, his hand hovering near his gun. "You giving orders now, stranger?" the man challenged. "Not orders." "Advice." Vaughn's stance was relaxed but ready. "The lady isn't part of whatever you're planning." Mrs. Holloway emerged from the kitchen, eyes widening at the tableau before her. She hurried to her husband, who appeared from a back room, a shotgun in his hands. "No trouble in my establishment," Holloway declared, leveling the weapon at the group. "Take it outside or settle down." The tension stretched for several seconds before the standing outlaw slowly returned to his seat, a malevolent smile playing on his lips. "Another time, then." Vaughn remained standing until Nora had safely reached the top of the stairs, then settled his bill with Holloway and followed her up. In the narrow hallway outside their rooms, he found her waiting, her face pale. "We need to leave," he said without preamble. "Those men won't let this go, and I don't want to bring trouble to these people." "But it's already dark," Nora protested. "We'll have moonlight," Vaughn replied, already moving toward his room. "Pack your things, we'll leave through the back." 20 minutes later, they were riding out of the settlement, keeping to the shadows as much as possible. The moon was nearly full, providing enough light to follow the trail. They rode in tense silence for several miles before Vaughn finally relaxed slightly. "I think we're clear," he said, slowing Phoenix to a walk. "They might follow in the morning, but we'll have a good head start." "Were they really that dangerous?" Nora asked. Vaughn nodded grimly. "The Blackwater gang has killed at least a dozen people that I know of." They wouldn't hesitate to hurt you to get to me, especially now that I've challenged them publicly." "I'm sorry," Nora said, guilt washing over her. "This is because of me, because of what happened in Redemption Creek." "No," Vaughn said firmly, "it's because men like that prey on others. You have nothing to apologize for." They continued riding for another hour before finding a defensible spot to make camp, a small hollow shielded by rocks that would hide their fire from distant observers. Despite the impromptu departure, Vaughn was methodical in establishing their camp, setting out bedrolls and preparing a small, smokeless fire. "I'll keep watch tonight," he said as they sat huddled near the flames for warmth, the spring night having grown chilly. "All night." "You need to rest too," Nora argued. Vaughn shook his head. "I've gone longer without sleep. It's safer this way." Nora studied him in the firelight, noticing the lines of fatigue around his eyes. "We could take turns," she suggested. "I may not know how to shoot or track, but I can certainly stay awake and wake you if I hear anything." After a moment's hesitation, Vaughn agreed. 2 hours, then wake me." Nora's watch passed uneventfully. The night was peaceful, with only the occasional hoot of an owl or rustle of small animals in the underbrush. She found herself watching Vaughn as he slept, the firelight casting soft shadows across his face. In repose, he looked younger, the habitual vigilance momentarily set aside. When it was time, she gently touched his shoulder. He woke instantly, hand moving to his gun before he registered her presence. "Your turn," Nora said softly. Vaughn nodded, sitting up. "Everything quiet, not a sound," she confirmed, settling onto her bedroll. "Good night, Vaughn." "Good night, Nora," he replied, his voice a gentle rumble in the darkness. She closed her eyes, surprisingly comfortable despite the hard ground and looming danger. Something had changed between them in the last day, a trust, perhaps even the beginnings of something deeper. As sleep claimed her, Nora realized that for the first time in her life she felt truly safe. Morning came too soon. Nora woke to find Vaughn already breaking camp, his movements efficient but tired. He had let her sleep longer than they had agreed. "We should reach the railroad by nightfall if we push hard," he said, handing her a cup of coffee. "From there, we can catch a train to Cheyenne tomorrow." "Do you think they followed us?" Nora asked, scanning the horizon nervously. "Possibly, we'll know soon enough." Vaughn's expression was grim. "We should get moving." They rode hard throughout the day, stopping only briefly to rest the horses and eat a cold lunch. Vaughn remained vigilant, frequently checking their back trail and keeping to high ground when possible for better visibility. By late afternoon, Nora's body ached from the punishing pace, but she made no complaint, understanding the necessity. As the sun began to set, they crested a rise and saw the railroad in the distance, a thin, dark line cutting through the landscape. Beyond it, the small town of Junction Springs sprawled along the tracks, its buildings glowing orange in the fading light. "We made it," Nora said with relief. Vaughn nodded, but his expression remained tense. "Let's not celebrate just yet. We still need to reach town safely." They had just started down the slope when Vaughn suddenly reined in, his body alert. "Riders," he said tersely, pointing to a dust cloud in the distance behind them. 3 of them moving fast. Fear gripped Nora's heart. "The men from the settlement." "Almost certainly," Vaughn confirmed, quickly assessing their options. "We won't outrun them to town. The horses are too tired." He pointed to a cluster of boulders off to their right. "Head there. We'll make a stand if we have to." They reached the boulders just as the riders came into clear view. Vaughn helped Nora dismount, then led the horses behind the largest rock. "Stay low," he instructed, drawing his rifle from its scabbard. "If anything happens to me, take Phoenix and ride hard for town. Don't look back." "Vaughn," Nora began, her voice catching. "It'll be all right," he assured her, though they both knew it might not be. "I've dealt with worse odds." He positioned himself behind a boulder, rifle ready as the riders approached. Nora crouched nearby, her heart thundering in her chest. She had never felt so helpless or so determined not to be a burden. The riders slowed as they neared the boulders, spreading out to approach from different angles. Vaughn remained perfectly still, waiting. "Garrison," called a voice Nora recognized from the settlement. "We know you're in there." "Send out the woman and we might let you live." "Not going to happen," Vaughn called back. Ride on and we'll forget this happened, a laugh echoed across the open ground. You're outgunned and outnumbered, don't be stupid. I'm only going to say this once, Vaughn replied, his voice carrying clearly in the still evening air. Leave now or I start shooting, and I don't miss. There was a moment of silence, then a gunshot rang out, the bullet splintering rock inches from Vaughn's position. He responded immediately, firing twice in quick succession. A cry of pain told Nora at least one shot had found its mark. Chaos erupted as bullets flew in both directions. Nora pressed herself against the rock, trying to make herself as small as possible. The gunfight seemed to last forever, though in reality it was probably less than a minute before a sudden silence fell. Vaughn, Nora whispered anxiously. I'm here, he replied, though his voice sounded strained. 2 down, the third is retreating. Nora peered around the boulder to see Vaughn still in position, but one hand was pressed to his side, dark blood seeping between his fingers. You're hurt, she gasped, scrambling to his side. Just a graze, Vaughn said, though his pallor suggested otherwise. We need to move before he brings reinforcements. Nora helped him to his feet, alarmed at how heavily he leaned on her. You need a doctor. Town first, Vaughn insisted, grimacing as they moved toward the horses. Help me up. With considerable effort, Nora managed to get Vaughn onto Phoenix. She then mounted her own horse, and they set off toward Junction Springs, moving as quickly as Vaughn's condition would allow. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, night had fallen completely, and Vaughn was swaying dangerously in the saddle. The town doctor, an elderly man named Pearson, answered their desperate knocking in his nightshirt but became all business when he saw Vaughn's condition. With Nora's help, he got Vaughn onto an examination table and cut away the blood-soaked shirt. Bullets still in there, doctor. Pearson announced after a brief examination. Needs to come out, miss, you might want to wait outside. I'm staying, Nora said firmly, already rolling up her sleeves. Tell me how I can help. The next hour was a nightmare of blood and pain as the doctor worked to extract the bullet and repair the damage it had caused. Vaughn remained conscious throughout most of it, his jaw clenched against the pain, his eyes often finding Nora's for comfort. She held his hand, wiped his brow, and assisted the doctor as best she could, refusing to leave even when the procedure became particularly gruesome. He's lucky, Dr. Pearson said when it was finally over. Bullet missed anything vital, lost a fair amount of blood, though. He'll need rest, lots of it. Thank you, doctor, Nora said, exhaustion evident in her voice. Is there somewhere he can stay to recover? There's a room upstairs, the doctor replied. My wife keeps it ready for patients who need watching overnight. You're welcome to it. With the doctor's help, they moved Vaughn to the upstairs room. Once he was settled, Dr. Pearson excused himself, promising to check in again before morning. Left alone with Vaughn, Nora pulled a chair close to the bed and took his hand in hers. His skin was cool and clammy, his breathing shallow but steady. You should rest, Vaughn murmured, his eyes opening slightly to look at her. So should you, Nora replied with a gentle smile. Doctor's orders. Did we make it to town? He asked, seemingly disoriented. Yes, we're safe now. The doctor removed the bullet. You're going to be fine. Vaughn's eyes drifted closed again. Good, he whispered. Couldn't bear it if anything happened to you. The simple declaration sent warmth flooding through Nora's chest. She squeezed his hand gently. Nothing happened to me, thanks to you. As Vaughn drifted into a fitful sleep, Nora maintained her vigil, watching the rise and fall of his chest, her mind replaying the events that had brought them to this point. In just a few days, this man had become more important to her than anyone else in her life. The realization was as frightening as it was exhilarating. Dawn was breaking when Vaughn stirred again, more lucid this time. You've been there all night, he observed, his voice stronger. Where else would I be? Nora replied simply. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You should have taken the bed. I would have managed in the chair. Always the gentleman, Nora said with a soft laugh. Even half dead, I've been called many things, but gentleman isn't usually one of them. Vaughn shifted slightly, wincing at the movement. What happened to the outlaws? The sheriff gathered a posse when we arrived in town. They found 2 bodies where we left them. The third man is still at large, but they're searching. Vaughn nodded, then fixed her with a serious look. This changes things, Nora. The train to Cheyenne leaves tomorrow and you should be on it. What about you? She asked, already dreading his answer. I'll follow when I can travel, he said, though they both knew it might be weeks before he was strong enough. It's safer for you to go ahead. No, Nora said firmly. I'm not leaving you here alone. Nora, I've made my decision, she interrupted. After everything we've been through, do you really think I'd abandon you now? Vaughn studied her face for a long moment, something vulnerable flickering in his eyes. Why? He asked softly. The question hung between them, simple yet profound. Nora took a deep breath, suddenly certain of what she needed to say. Because in just a few days, you've shown me more kindness and respect than anyone ever has, because you risked your life for me without hesitation. She paused, gathering her courage. Because when I think about continuing this journey without you, I can't bear it. Vaughn's hand tightened around hers. Nora, he began, his voice rough with emotion. What I did at the saloon, stopping your father, anyone with decency would have done the same. But it wasn't anyone, it was you. Nora moved from the chair to sit carefully on the edge of the bed. And everything since then has only confirmed what I felt from the beginning, that you're a good man, Vaughn Garrison. The kind of man I never thought I'd be fortunate enough to meet. Vaughn reached up slowly, his hand gentle as it cupped her cheek. I've spent years trying to outrun my past, never staying in one place long enough to form attachments. Then I walked into that saloon and saw you standing there, and something changed. Nora leaned into his touch, her heart racing. What happens now? She whispered. I don't know, Vaughn admitted, but I do know I'm not ready to say goodbye to you, Nora Rivers. Then don't, she replied simply and leaned down to press her lips to his. The kiss was gentle, mindful of his injuries, but filled with all the emotions they'd been holding back. When they finally parted, Nora rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing a little faster. Stay with me, Vaughn murmured. Not just until I heal, but after. Come to Montana with me. Yes, Nora answered without hesitation. Though I should warn you, I still don't know how to ride very well. A genuine laugh escaped Vaughn, followed by a groan as the movement pulled at his stitches. We'll have plenty of time for lessons, he promised, pulling her close again. As spring turned to summer, Vaughn recovered his strength. They remained in Junction Springs during his convalescence, Nora finding work at the town's small hotel while Vaughn gradually resumed light activities. The third outlaw was eventually captured trying to rob a stagecoach near Laramie, bringing closure to that chapter of their journey. By July, they were ready to continue north to Montana. The night before their departure, Vaughn proposed properly, offering Nora a simple gold band he had commissioned from the town's jeweler. It's not much, he said apologetically as he slipped it onto her finger, but I promise you this, you'll never be anyone's property. You'll be my partner, my equal in all things. Tears welled in Nora's eyes as she examined the ring. It's perfect, she whispered, and so is your promise. They were married the next morning in the town's small church with Dr. Pearson and his wife as witnesses. By afternoon, they were on the trail again, heading north toward their future together. Montana welcomed them with vast skies and rolling grasslands perfect for ranching. Using a portion of the money Vaughn had originally offered her father, they purchased a modest property near a growing settlement. The land had a creek running through it, and a view of distant mountains, everything Nora had dreamed of when she spoke of windows that looked out on something beautiful. As autumn approached, they completed work on their cabin, small but sturdy, with a stone fireplace and bookshelves Vaughn had crafted himself. On the day they moved in, he carried her across the threshold, both of them laughing at the traditional gesture. Welcome home, Mrs. Garrison, he said, setting her down gently. Nora looked around at the home they had built together, then back at the man who had saved her in more ways than one. I've been home since the moment I met you, she replied, reaching up to touch his face. Everything else is just details. Outside, the Montana sunset painted the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple. A spectacular backdrop to the beginning of their life together, a life neither of them could have imagined that day in Redemption Creek, when her father shouted out a price, and a stranger had the courage to say what needed to be said. That she was not his to sell, that no person should ever be property, that freedom and love were rights no one could auction away. And as Vaughn pulled her close for a kiss in the home they had built together, Nora knew with absolute certainty that some things truly were beyond price, like the love they had found against all odds in the vast, untamed wilderness of the American West.